Hey everyone, there are a couple of webinars coming up at Renegade University that are very popular and I thought you should know about. First, beginning on January 5th, that's a Tuesday, we have Postmodernism, Critical Theory, and American Politics, co-taught by James Lindsay and me. Many of you know James from his appearance on Unregistered several months ago. James has made quite a name for himself as a critic of postmodernism and critical theory. He and I have a lot of fundamental disagreements on many of the core issues in those schools of thought. So this will be unique among university seminars. We will have not just a dialogue, we will also have an ongoing debate for the 3 Tuesdays this webinar is meeting. Those are the first 3 Tuesdays in January. We're going to have to cap this very soon because it's selling out very fast. We want to make sure that everyone has the chance to participate fully in the webinar. So get your tickets soon. Go to renegadeuniversity.com. You'll see it under video courses or just scroll down to the bottom of the screen there. Also, beginning in the last Tuesday of January, January 26th, we will have another 3-part webinar taught by Kamasi Hill. It's called Talkin' Shit, The History of Hip Hop. Hotep Jesus has already registered as a student. We have many people who are going to take this as well. We will also have to cap that. So again, go to renegadeuniversity.com and get your tickets now. Thanks. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. If you want to know precisely what Donald Trump did in terms of foreign policy, if you want to know what Joe Biden is likely to do with the rest of the world, and if you want to know what the intentions are of Russia and China, you are not like most Americans. But you will find this episode to be absolutely essential listening. This is my interview with James Carden. I am joined from Buffalo, New York by someone who lives in Washington, D.C. most of the time, by someone I greatly admire and I've been wanting to have on the show for a while. I'm super thrilled to have him here. The great journalist, James Carden. Thanks for coming on the show, James.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So we have a lot to talk about. I've been reading you in The Nation. I've been reading you in The American Conservative. I've been reading you all over the place. You've never had a staff position, have you, in journalism? Or have you?
I know.
Right. So you've always been independent and freelance, essentially. And you've written sort of across the spectrum politically. But how would you describe let me just ask you this right off the bat. How would you describe your politics? And how would you describe your views on foreign policy in general? How would you characterize them?
Right. So there's a lot of confusion as to why my byline frequently appears in both The American Conservative and The Nation.
Right.
And the answer is that I come out of a tradition of American realism. So it's no accident that I was first on the masthead as a contributing editor in my, I think, mid to late 30s at the National Interest magazine. So that's really where I got my start, and that's really what I identify with. And I don't bother too much with cultural issues. Though I've written a bit on economics, I would identify myself as an old-fashioned social democrat. So I would lean left very much on economics, but I'm no fan of woke politics. It would be that, and I got to that through my reading in graduate school of thinkers like George F. Kennan and Reinhold Niebuhr and Walter Lippmann and people like that. So those are the types of writers in that tradition that
Ah.
I've tried to uphold. Writers such as Stephen Walton, John J. Mearsheimer made a huge impact on my writing and thinking on American foreign policy.
Yeah. Okay. I did not know that about you. I didn't actually. I should have picked it up in your writing, but I didn't. So talk about realism. I mean, the schools of thought, or the school of thought of realism, and what it's sort of counterpoised against.
Well, in recent decades, it's been counterpoised against neoconservatism, which
Hmm.
I believe is probably the single most malign school of thought in the United States. And I mean, anyone can make a mistake, right? I've certainly made many, many in my life.
Right.
And the neocons made a grave misjudgment back in 2003. The problem is that they never have seemed to learn from it. And so a disaster ensued after the US government pursued the policies that they were advocating. And no one has ever said, no one has ever said, I'm sorry. I think it was Stephen Walt who wrote that being a neocon means never having to say you're sorry. That is what I find most odious about them. I think that there is maybe one prominent neocon who actually was forthright about the disasters.
Huh.
And that was Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a very good book about that. I think it was called America at the Crossroads, though. I'd have to check. It's been a while since I looked at that.
Yeah.
So they're extremely dishonest. And not only are they dishonest, they seem to cling to power. And so what we have now in Congress, one of the most powerful congresswomen on the Republican side is the daughter of Dick Cheney, Liz Cheney, and she has been advocating every bit for the same sort of insane policies that will result in nothing but bloodshed and pain and loss of treasure if we pursue them. So they've gone nowhere. And another problem with them is that because, and we can get into this later, I suppose, but what we've seen in the Trump era is that they've been welcomed with open arms by the Democratic Party. So the Democrats and liberals and certain progressives have made common cause with the neoconservatives because of their ostensible opposition to Donald Trump. And that's one of the more troubling one of the more troubling developments of the Trump era.
Yeah. So, okay, great. So the school of realism originated as a critique and response to, and maybe rejection of Woodrow Wilsonian what's called idealism, right? The idea that America is so wonderful and its ideas are so powerful and godly, which is actually how Wilsonians have talked about it, including today, that they must be spread around the world by any means necessary, essentially. And the neocons, as many, many people know, began on the left. They were either hard left Marxists like Irving Kristol, or they were social democratic liberals like Norman Podhoretz back in the 50s. And then, of course, their sons took over the mantle, and they gave rise to a whole generation that gave us the Iraq War. So I've been saying now that they've come back to the Democratic Party, they've come back. I think they've found their home again. This is their true home. I think they joined with the Republicans and the Bushies simply because of the opportunity. But they are at heart, they're New York Jewish liberals who are interested in state intervention in domestic policy, and that's the war. I almost called it the war on children, No Child Left Behind policy, which was a war on children if you take it from me, because my son suffered from it for 13 years, and also obviously in foreign policy. So I see them returning to the Democrats as a natural realignment. Do you see that?
I do. I remember writing about the kind of troubling phenomenon of the neocons returning to the Democrats as early as 2015, when Robert Kagan was making noises that he was no longer a neoconservative. He was just a liberal interventionist, and he was pro-Hillary. And he ended up hosting a fundraiser for Hillary Clinton. And they have never made any bones about it. I mean, Irving Kristol himself once wrote that we will go to whatever party will support our policies. So, and what's been very frustrating is that the warnings that people like myself, and then people who have an actual audience like Glenn Greenwald and Taibbi, have been warning Democrats about this for a number of years. And the Democrats have just been so blinded, so myopic in their hatred for Trump, that they just made common cause with the very worst people in Washington. And that's where we are. That's where we are today. And you can see this very clearly in the cabinet appointments that Joe Biden has made. I always thought I always found it kind of darkly amusing that the progressives, after getting blown out of the water earlier this year by Joe Biden, had the gall to tell people that, oh, that's all right. We're still going to we came out of this really well, and we're going to be able to push Joe Biden left, and he owes us progressives. Well, as we have now seen,
not so much
going anywhere. And indeed, many of his national security appointments have been applauded by such neoconservatives as Jennifer Rubin and the rest.
All of them, they love it. I mean,
yeah. And why wouldn't they? They're right to be taking their victory lap.
Yeah. So I want you to give the full analysis of of Biden's foreign policy team, because I know I will want that, and I know listeners will want it too. Should we do that now, or I also want to give you? I also want you to get your scorecard on Trump's foreign policy. So which do you want to do first?
You're in charge.
So oh yeah, that's right. I am. Let's go back to Trump for a second. I'd love to hear give him a grade, and let's hear your breakdown. Like, if you were to write a short history of Donald Trump's foreign policy, what would it look like?
I guess, how would you start? Well, he had the right idea. I guess rhetoric doesn't always, rhetoric always doesn't transform into policy, right? So he was making some of the right noises in 2016 before he became president. I thought America First, far from being a sinister throwback, was actually probably the right idea after 2 decades of endless war. He was making the right noises with regard to some sort of détente with Russia. That relations, well, I don't forget, you don't forget, but many forget that relations with the world's second largest nuclear power in the United States were really at a low point, perhaps at the worst point since the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we got to the end of the Obama administration. He was making the right noises with regard to getting tough on China, not in a militaristic way, but in terms of the way that our economies interact. He was always very bad on Israel, due mainly to I can only guess, mainly to due to the influence of his son-in-law. And he was making a lot of the right noises on the forever wars. And then he got into office. And being someone who knows nothing, he appointed a cabal of people who hated each and every one of those things about him and his vision. But in a way, it would be hard to blame him, because he had no idea how Washington worked. He had no idea who these people were. And so what you had was Donald Trump, the kind of sort of realist, appointing the hardest of hardcore neoconservatives to staff his administration. And so that you have Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State. You have, at some point, you have John Bolton. You have the current Guy O'Brien is quite hardline. And on it went. And every time that the president tried to, and Bolton lays this out actually very clearly in his horrible memoir. every time that Trump tried to withdraw troops, he would be undermined by his people who he had appointed, by the bureaucracy. That was particularly true in the case of Syria. And it was a real missed opportunity. So I guess I would call the book, a great missed opportunity, the Donald Trump years. And it wasn't like there weren't people who he knew and who would have been very happy to have served within the administration. Here I have in mind the great former retired Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Macgregor finally got a senior appointment in the Pentagon within the last few months of the administration. But if he had known more, he would have appointed someone like Macgregor to be Secretary of Defense or National Security Advisor instead of people who he ended up appointing, people like Mark Esper, who has long ties to Pompeo personally, but also to Raytheon and the defense industry. So Donald Trump had, I think, some good instincts with regard to foreign policy, but was ultimately unable to fulfill that vision. So D minus.
Yeah, I mean, to me, they're all mass murderers, so they all get an F. But I suppose, if you remove that stigma, I would give him maybe a C minus. But I thought that it was pretty remarkable, and certainly it was unprecedented, absolutely, for a major candidate and then a president to voice skepticism at all of the American empire, of nation building, of regime change, of foreign interventions, of endless wars. I mean, no one, as you know, ever in American history that close to power has voiced even doubts about it, about the whole project of a Pax Americana, of the United States as the global policeman, all that stuff. Not one ever, right? So,
yeah, he was almost sounding like, Ron Paul at points during
moments
the campaign.
Yeah. I think, let me throw this by you. There's a few different strains of thought as I see it on the right. There's the Trump nationalist, right, which is America first, which could be called sort of like old-fashioned isolationism, although isolationism is a bad term in general. But I kind of see that hostility to foreign intervention generally, right, or at least a skepticism. Then there's the John McCain, right, then there's the neocons, right, who we said want the United States to be a global empire. That's why we need to have hundreds of military bases all over the world, which we have. That's their vision. And we want to have not direct colonial control over all of the other countries, but we want to have managerial, regulatory control over trade and international relations generally. And that's why we have the UN and the World Court and all the things that were built by the liberals after World War II. But then there's another strain, which, correct me if I might be wrong about this, but kind of the John McCain thinking, which I think is also sort of Boltonite, and I think it's a bit like the other guy, Pompeo. I think they're not actually really neocons because they don't quite have that big, grand vision. They're not really intellectuals in that way. They're to me, I read them as, we're going to kill anybody who messes with the United States. Once there's an enemy, it's all out annihilation, right? Which is what happened with ISIS, just absolute annihilation. But I don't hear, and Bolton, a lot of the neocons didn't love Bolton, I think in part because he didn't quite have this grand vision that they have. Is that wrong?
I would just say in terms of Bolton, I think that they didn't care for Bolton because he didn't leave the party and Trump at the same time. Bolton sort of cynically held his fire, went on Fox, and really maneuvered for position in the Trump administration. And then once he got the job and left the job, then he rejoined them. So I think that there's an element of trust there, only because Bolton is even slimier than your regular neocon,
right?
And they were put off by his obscene opportunism.
I was going to say, well, see, to me, that's what makes him not a neocon. The neocons need to be taken seriously as true believers. Doesn't mean you have to like them, but in a way, you have to respect them. I mean, to me, they are the enemy, but they really believe this stuff. They really, in their souls, right? They've devoted their lives to this.
Well, it's like the way I feel about Mitch McConnell. I disagree with everything about Mitch McConnell, but I have
Right.
deep respect for the way he plays the game.
Yeah, right.
You can't, so yeah, that's the way that the many of the neocons operate. I would make a distinction between McCain and Pompeo, though.
Okay.
Obviously, no one would ever misidentify John McCain as an intellectual, but yeah, I would put more McCain in the kind of traditional, school of Republican hawks. Pompeo is different from McCain in that Pompeo is part of that very dangerous tradition in the United States of evangelical Zionists. And so he really is motivated by that stuff. And I think the one area that I would probably dare to disagree with, Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer on their thesis about the Israel lobby is that the most dangerous aspect and powerful aspect of the Israel lobby are not Jewish organizations. They're American Christian Zionists,
right?
And they have infiltrated the Defense Department, to its highest levels.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be the only distinction I would make in terms of Pompeo, McCain, and the rest.
Have you ever bought CBD in the past? Are you thinking about buying it in the future? If so, I strongly recommend you get it from a company whose values you share, and most importantly, because you're smart, you're an unregistered listener, so I know you're smart, from a company who's going to give you the best discount out there. And that company, I'm proud to say, is the sponsor of the Unregistered podcast, Paloma Verde CBD. Based out of San Antonio, Texas, owned and operated by Carlos and Vanessa Abelar, who are both longtime friends and fans of this podcast. They tried to get loans and accounts from banks, and they were denied because they were a so-called marijuana-related business. How ridiculous is that? Despite all that, despite the lockdown that caused their brick and mortar store in San Antonio to be shut down right after it was opened, despite all that, Paloma Verde has thrived in large part because of you, unregistered listeners. Dozens, I think scores actually, of you have bought their products and have reported to me repeatedly that they love the customer service that Vanessa and Carlos give them, and most importantly, the products, which I stand by entirely. Go to palomaverdestore.com, use the discount code Renegade. You will get 25% off every single product they sell. If you join their mailing list, you get another 10% off, which is 35% off your first order. And then Carlos and Vanessa have put together my 3 favorite products into what's called the Unregistered Combo Pack, also known as the THAD Pack, which includes their high potency tincture, which is my very favorite thing. I put a few drops under my tongue, and I promise you it helps so much with my anxiety and my insomnia. Very common problems these days, given all the anxiety that's out there in the world. It also includes their absolutely delicious fruit-flavored gummies, which are 10 milligrams of CBD per gummy. And their soft gels, 25 milligrams per soft gel. I use those every day, 2, 3, 4, 5, sometimes 6 a day, because it really helps me in so many ways. Again, go to palomaverdestore.com, use the discount code Renegade, get your discount, get your CBD, make your life and your body and your mood and everything better. And I thank you so much. How much power do you think the Israel lobby has? I mean, in other words, to me, it sometimes seems like people are accusing it of the tail wagging the dog, right? And by the way, my position on Israel is that it should be completely defunded by the United States today. I'm not opposed to the state of Israel existing. I just don't want to have any part in it. I don't want to support it because I see it as actually self-destructive for Jews. So that's clear. But the Walt Mearsheimer thesis about the Israel lobby, I am not totally won over by, even though I'm a fan of theirs. I think they grant too much power. It's the choice of, as you said, people who are not only not necessarily Zionist, but not even Jewish, their choice of Israel as essentially America's proxy in the Middle East, as America's first line of defense in the Middle East, as America's tip of the spear in the Middle East, right? Right. I mean, beginning with Johnson in the 60s, right? We've over and over and over again, administration after administration, none of them Jewish, none of them necessarily Zionist.
Or even before, I would say even beginning with Truman.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was the first recognition, but really like propping up Israel begins in about 1967, 68, right?
Yeah, I would say that if there was even not a single Jewish Zionist organization in the United States, we would probably still be in the same position, because both countries share a sort of teleological view of history. So no, I think it would be and is unfair to simply, and I don't think that they were doing it. I think that they were more nuanced than that. But as I say, my view is that it's really the evangelicals who are really driving that policy. And I agree. Yeah, in terms of Israel right to exist, yeah, absolutely. What I don't care for, though, is the term that is also attached to Israel whenever a politician talks about it, and that is the word ally. We're not in a treaty of alliance with them, and they do not act like allies. They have a very serious, robust espionage network aimed at us, as does Russia, as does China, as do a lot of countries. So under Netanyahu, they've had a habit of trying to humiliate high-level American politicians. I think that we would all do well to remember the time that Joe Biden, as vice president, went over to Israel. And while he was there, and the ostensible purpose of that trip was to talk about the settlements, and they blindsided. Biden lands, and the Israelis blindside Biden and announced a huge expansion of settlements that they're going to do. So they were constantly sticking their finger in the eye of the Obama-Biden administration, going so far as to really overtly endorsing Romney in 2012, which, again, we can talk about foreign interference all we want, but any discussion of foreign interference in American politics would have to begin not only with Israel, but it would have to also begin with the Gulf state tyrannies. And then we can get all excited about Twitter memes and Facebook ads and all that, the rest of that junk.
Yeah. I mean, the origins of America's love affair with Israel, I believe, has to do with the Suez Canal's proximity to it, right? Beginning with the Truman administration in the 40s, but then in the 50s and 60s, subsequent administrations really were like, oh, most of the world's oil goes right through that little passageway, and it's right directly to the south of the state of Israel. So it seems to me we would want to have friends on both sides of that, which is why the top two recipients of foreign aid since then have been Israel on the top of the Suez Canal and Egypt on the bottom of it. So we have that sucker surrounded. Very practical. I mean, this is what Kissinger and other realists have said in the past. Which at least that sort of makes sense in some sort of geopolitical strategic way, right? But it's interesting that Israel has many times been arrogant in its relationship with the United States, I would say, and acted as if it did wag the dog, right? And I don't know if you've ever seen Henry Kissinger has this phenomenal speech that he gave to the Klutznik group. I think it's 1975. You can look it up online, which was a group of like very powerful Jewish philanthropists, bankers, I think political leaders, et cetera, sort of thought leaders, Jewish leaders in the United States. And it's a scolding. This is after the big wars in Israel, which basically solidified its control of the region, right? And he says, Jews constantly make the mistake that they think they're the most important people on earth. Well, guess what? I'm telling you right now, you're not. And you know who is the most important people on us, the United States? And you're going to do what we say, not the other way around. And this, of course, is Henry Kissinger, survivor of the Holocaust, talking. So it's a very, when Israel swings right to the Likud, right, and Netanyahu type politics, that's when they tend to get very a little too big for their britches, I think, but U.S. But the thing is, the Obama administration let them get away with it, right? And that's, to me, the real problem. Yeah,
there was a change at some point, I would say, probably in the in the 1990s, when Israel all of a sudden became off limits just to criticize on any grounds, right? So allies and friends ought to be able to criticize one another honestly. And I believe it was Secretary of State James Baker who actually banned Bibi Netanyahu from going into the State Department. There's a story. It was either Schultz or Baker, but Netanyahu was I think a low-ranking member of the embassy, and he banned him from entering the department. And Reagan was very tough on Begin at times, and so honesty is sort of a key aspect of, as I was saying, as friendship. I think that special relationships are bad for countries. So we think we've touched upon why the special relationship between the United States and Israel is not particularly good for the United States. The special relationship between the United States and Great Britain hasn't been that great either, right? I can't help but wonder if in the lead up to the Iraq War, if we didn't have a special relationship with the UK and we just had a regular relationship with the UK, that they would have been more honest with us, right? Because the French were honest with us, the Germans were honest with us, even the Russians were honest with us. Not that by any stretch of the imagination we were friends with them at that point, but the British weren't. They went right along with it. So I think that, that would be something very healthy if we could get to a point where we could just end the so-called special relationships. I think it was Lord Palmerston who said that countries don't have permanent friends, that they have permanent interests. And that would be something that I think that would be a welcome return to American foreign policy discourse, if indeed I quote right.
So you're sounding very America first now.
Yeah, I am a little bit.
Right. So speaking of America first, let's go back to Trump. I am still, how long has it been? It hasn't been that long, a couple months now, since we found out that the envoy, was he the ambassador to Syria or the special envoy to Syria?
Yeah.
Withheld information about the actual number of troops in Syria from the executive branch. James, tell me that, I mean, was this not the most outrageous thing in a long line of outrageous? I mean, I still can't get over that this happened, and that it's essentially a non-issue now. It's been done.
I think it's a non-issue because everyone in the media is on the same side as that special envoy. When Trump, this is another one of the Trump appointments that we can point to. James Jeffries is a radical neocon, and it was simply unbelievable to me that Trump appointed him as a special envoy to Syria. But again, this shows the depth of Trump's ignorance, and it shows perhaps even the depth of the ignorance of a lot of his advisors who signed on to these things. But it seems to me that he had the whole bureaucracy working against him. This is not to make him out to be some sort of victim or anything. He's a horrible president and an awful human being. But he was elected in a free and fair election, so he does have the right to call the shots, and he has a right to appoint justices that we don't like, and to appoint high government officials that we disagree with. The problem is that he was appointing high government officials who disagree with him. So he gets a lot of criticism for being soft, being Putin's best friend, soft on Russia, all this stuff. The fact of the matter is, in almost every area, he has taken a harder line against Russia than the Obama administration did. He armed Ukraine. He increased the sanctions against Russia. He has pulled out of the INF. They are in the process of scuttling a New Start. He is, totally the thing that one of the things that the Russians most care about his arms control policy and nuclear non-proliferation policy. And Trump has taken a sledgehammer to all that. So when people say that Trump has been in the pocket of Putin, it shows sort of the level of their ignorance of the matter. And there is, as we've discussed prior to hitting the record button, the amount of ignorance among progressives and liberals on Russia is astounding. Indeed, it seems to be bottomless.
Bottomless. Yeah, sort of an indifference, but just a willingness to take the line given to them by what's called the deep state, I suppose, by the Democratic Party, who's been hawkish on Russia for decades, right? And I definitely we're going to get into that, the history of NATO and its expansion under the Clintons and subsequent expansion is really the big story. It's the main reason I wanted to have you on the show, actually, but all of this is really, really great. James Jeffries, the guy who did not tell Trump the right number of troops in Syria, so to stop him from withdrawing troops from Syria, I forgot, or maybe I didn't know, that he had a neocon credentials. What are they?
Yeah, so he came from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy.
Oh.
So he is a long time, he's been a long time think tank fixture.
Okay. Was he like a signer to PNAC and all that back in the day? Do we know?
That I don't know.
Yeah. But definitely neocon-ish, at least.
I have no doubt he would have signed.
Okay. Gotcha. Good enough. I mean, was that not the most outrageous thing? I still...
One of them. I mean, really, take your pick over the past 20 years.
It's unprecedented, though. I don't know of any time in American history where the executive has been lied to by one of its own diplomats about something as important as troop levels in another country. And especially when the guy admits that he did it to subvert policy in said country. I've never heard of that. Has that ever happened? I'm a historian. I should know this, but I've never. Can you think of any instance of that?
I can think of something close. Do you remember the Dissent Channel memo that the Career State Department people issued protesting?
Early on in the Trump administration. Yeah. Right. But that wasn't outright.
I thought they were supposed to be diplomats.
Yeah, right. I mean, that was definitely
the quaint sort of idea that professional diplomats cared about diplomacy, but I guess I'm just out of touch.
You're old-fashioned.
Yeah.
I still cannot believe that happened, and that most of all that they got away with it almost scot-free. I mean, aside from the criticism from like friends of ours, basically it's been untouched. It's just amazing. I mean, if we have, especially when the president is attempting to end a war, I mean, for unelected diplomats to stop that process from happening by lying to the executive, I mean, that guy should be, I mean, it's treason. Like this is the highest crime in the land, is it not? Like,
well, there's another instance of Trump's policy being subverted by people who are supposed to take orders from him and work for him. I think that one of the more interesting things that came out during the impeachment hearings was the efforts by people on the National Security Council to subvert Trump's policy or Trump's efforts to discuss national security issues with his counterpart in Ukraine. I thought that was extremely worrying that a young-ish lieutenant colonel took it upon himself to be the referee and decide that, well, what Trump seems to be doing is going against what this young lieutenant colonel called the interagency. Right? So he seems to be under the impression that it's the interagency that makes foreign policy and the president is supposed to carry it out. I, based on what little education I have, was under the impression that it was the other way around.
Oh, the
But
Constitution.
this guy ended up becoming on the, he was on the cover of Time magazine or Newsweek or something like
What's
that.
that guy's name again? The geeky lieutenant general.
Yeah.
What's his name?
Vindman.
Vinman, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So Vindman thought that it was his role to do that, and take it upon himself to basically single-handedly bring the president to the edge of impeachment. So.
James, you're bringing up the Constitution again, which is so tedious. We have
I know a lot.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's good and evil in the world. We all know that. And what, you're gonna let some rules get in the way of stopping evil?
I know. Silly me.
Yeah, that's why we're bad people. So speaking of you're not being a bad person, back to the Democrats. You have a little history there. You were, and I don't know I told you before we started recording I was going to ask you this because I was really curious about it, and I don't know what the story is here, but you worked in Obama's State Department.
Did.
How did that go down? Because you're not the right guy for that job, are you?
No, it turned out not. But I didn't leave for policy reasons. But it was simply a mid-career fellowship. I wasn't a journalist or anything like that before I entered the department. So my career sort of has gone everywhere. I've managed to fail out of 3 or 4 careers. So I started on Wall Street, and that didn't work. And then I went to graduate school. And then after graduate school, I got this mid-career fellowship at the department.
Okay.
And that was a very good experience. I thought that by and large, the Foreign Service officers and the career people there are, very dedicated, very, very bright, good people for the most part. And it was not a bad experience at all. And then that ran out of time, as fellowships do. And it was just about that time when things started to go haywire in Ukraine, and a lot of the things that I was reading in the press and by prominent commentators, it sort of struck me as though they didn't know what they were talking about, and indeed had probably never been to the region. And so I started writing for the National Interest, and so then I kind of am an accidental journalist. So the accident has been going on for about 7 years now. So I had no applications, or I wasn't even on the student newspaper. So maybe you can tell by my writing, but so that's how that happened. And so I wasn't really overtly political in any way up until.
Yeah, they didn't know who you were yet, or maybe you didn't know who you were yet. You were working specifically on Russia too, right? In the State Department.
Yeah. I worked on the Office of Russian Affairs and with one of Secretary Clinton's aides. Oh
my Lord. Yeah, that's right. You were working under Hillary Clinton.
Yes.
How do you feel about that?
I actually shook her hand. I met her at a reception. And, yeah. So,
what did you get from that?
She's tiny. That's what I got.
Tiny?
Oh yeah. She's small, and she's actually attractive. Yeah. So, but it was a very strange thing. I think it was the people who were on the fellowship. So there was like 100 of us or something like that. And it was like a pep rally almost. People were really going crazy. It was embarrassing. It was like,
wow.
The Beatles in '64. I just kind of stood off to the side and kind of took it in. But
so you're saying there was
an element of that, in politics, right? So
you're saying there was a cult of personality around Hillary Clinton.
I'm saying you could perceive the beginnings of such a thing.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Gosh. Okay, so sort of accidental that you got in there. Yeah. I didn't realize you'd only been a journalist for 7 years. That's really remarkable. All right. So I know people are going to want to hear your take on the incoming team, the foreign policy team that Biden and Harris are assembling. Let's go through it. Tell us about who's going to be running American foreign policy for the next 4 to 8 years.
Right. Eight. Well, I can't say that, I guess I would begin by saying I can't say that unlike a lot of progressives, I'm not surprised by this at all. Right. I had no illusions that Biden was going to all of a sudden can become a progressive or a non-hawk. He's been a liberal interventionist, hardline hawk for almost 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
You don't change your stripes at 70. What is he? 77, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So Antony Blinken has been an aide to. So he's the Secretary of State designee. He's been with Biden for years and years and years. He was an aide to him in the Senate. He went with him when Biden became VP. He was Deputy National Security Advisor and then Deputy Secretary of State. I think he was also Biden's principal National Security Advisor.
Yep.
And he's a creature of the Washington establishment, and his positions are every bit as dangerous as you would expect them to be from someone who has spent 25 years doing the bidding of the establishment.
Mm-hmm.
And the same, I think, could be said for the incoming Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines. And certainly the same could be said for the incoming National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. The difference is that Jake Sullivan came up through Clinton world and is a longtime aide to Hillary Clinton,
right?
Whereas Blinken has been primarily with Biden. I think that the appointment of Sullivan, and this isn't a national security appointment, but I think it's worth mentioning only because I find it so darkly amusing, is that Neera Tanden is going to be director of the Office of Management and Budget. So I think that if you see Sullivan and Tanden getting into the administration, it's not a big leap to say that Hillary Clinton still exercises enormous pull within the party and is indeed calling some of the shots. And of course, her and Joe Biden are known to be very close. So Hillary is not walking into the sunset. So
yeah,
I think that the appointment of a career foreign service officer to the post of UN ambassador is a very good one.
Mm-hmm.
So some credit there. I think that the pick for Secretary of Defense could have been a lot worse. It seems to me that General Austin has exercised some judgment and is able to exercise some discernment, unlike perhaps the woman who was supposed to get the job, Michelle Fournoy, who was just reflexively hawkish. Right, people who have been in wars tend to be more discerning when it comes to things like that. So I think that's a welcome appointment. Who might I be missing in the?
Let's talk about the think tank that spawned a lot of these people, right? Don't they all come out of what's it called? What's Flournoy's think tank? She has two outfits, but what's the main think tank that does this, the foreign policy stuff?
Yeah, Center for New American Security.
Yeah,
is the think tank, and then the money machine is West Exec. West Exec Advisors.
Yeah.
It's named after West Executive Avenue, which is the street that separates the NSC, the old Executive Office Building, and the White House. So it's some real insider stuff there. So that's why
and they're not shy about it.
Right. They named it. So her and Blinken founded that after the Obama administration. I guess they did quite well, as you would expect. Yeah. So Center for a New American Security was Flournoy headed that think tank, along with a man by the name of Richard Fontaine. Richard Fontaine's a Republican and a longtime aide to John McCain. So
Ah,
what we have is, so we were just talking about this um, at the top of the show. Here you have in this one think tank the marriage between liberal interventionist Democratic hawks
yeah.
and neoconservative Republicans in all in one all in one building.
All right, let's talk about Russia.
Do we have
Russia, Russia, James. Russia is what we heard for 3.5 years there. Russia was responsible for my asthma, I think, last year. And probably when you got the flu too. So, and you know this stuff as well as anyone, and you were actually working with the people who were on the other side of this, both sides of this. Yeah, you're kind of unique in a way. I don't know of anybody else who's kind of worked with both sides of this. What what is it about Russia that drives the Clinton and Obama and Biden people and the Michelle Flournoy people and the Blinken people completely nuts? And what is it? Why does it drive them crazy? And what do they want ultimately to do about Russia, do you think? This is the
Okay,
question.
I think that in terms of the sort of Russia hysteria, it reached sort of McCarthyite levels after the election, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know why, right? So look, obviously there was some level of interference, right? Not to the point of vote count changes and all that stuff, but all that stuff, it's absolutely credible that they were on doing social media stuff and fine. Even if that hadn't happened, right? So if Hillary had won the election, this wouldn't have happened. The hysteria of 3 or 4 years and stuff like that would have just been swept under the rug, and it would have been a minor story, as it should have been, given the levels of interference of other countries, which we touched upon earlier. So even if Trump hadn't won, we would still be in a very bad place with Russia. And I think that this goes back to a sort of disillusionment stemming from the failure of America to remake Russia in its image in the 1990s. So that project went awry. I mean, it went seriously awry. The Clinton administration made enormous efforts to prop up Boris Yeltsin, make Russia into an American-style capitalist economy. And they really, in the end, backed the wrong horse. Mr. Yeltsin was an incompetent. He was a serious alcoholic. He had other health problems. He was extremely corrupt. And all those hopes that went into remaking Russia in America's image with Yeltsin at the head came crashing down. And it was Yeltsin, of course, who appointed Vladimir Putin to become his successor, right? And I think that there's a sense of they're not really blaming the right person. All the blame goes to Vladimir Putin for Russia's trajectory, but really they ought to be blaming the guy who they themselves backed. So I think there's a psychological element in it, and they can't really come to grips with the fact that they themselves are responsible for what's happened in the ensuing years. When Putin first came on the scene, there was some hope even among the hardest line Russophobes in government at the time that he would be a breath of fresh air. Madeleine Albright, right, who is a Democratic hawk, dismissed what she called all this psychobabble about Vladimir Putin and the KGB, right? And really, that's what it is. He was a not particularly high-ranking case officer in East Germany, right? He's not some sort of spy mastermind. No, or at least he wasn't in early in his career, right? So there was some hope there, but he was going to chart his own his own way. And he had to get the economy under control. He had to get the oligarchs under control. He had to rebuild Russia's defenses. And there were points at which he was rather anxious to cooperate with the Americans. Now, this is 20 years ago, right? He was the first world leader to call George W. Bush after 9/11. Later on, the Russians were instrumental in helping the United States establish the Northern Distribution Network, through which we would send cargo. It was an air corridor, cargo and troops to Afghanistan, right? But the problem is that, the Russians were, like the French and Germans, were very outspoken against the Iraq War. We ignored them, right? And they were very outspoken against the idea, now this is some years later, against the idea of overthrowing Gaddafi in Libya. We ignored them, right? Syria, we find ourselves on opposite sides. And then finally in Ukraine, again, opposite sides. The driver of a lot of this stuff, though, is our project of NATO expansion.
Right.
The Russians were too weak to do anything about the first wave of expansion in the 90s. And I don't think that they wouldn't have been able to do much about that anyway. There's no reason, if we were going to continue the alliance, there was no reason not to bring in Poland, for instance, right? But the expansion project kept creeping up closer and closer and closer and closer to their border. And that is naturally going to alarm any competent leader, right? And so once it became clear that we were going to start to try to get some of their closest allies, some of their that were former republics of the Soviet Union, to bring them into the mix, that was a red line for them. And so, they even not allowed, but they didn't make too much noise, I don't think, when Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania came in. But it's a different ballgame when we started to talk about Ukraine and Georgia. The problem with this project of NATO expansion, is my much missed friend and mentor used to say all the time, Steve Cohen, is that in the first Cold War, the epicenter of the division was in Berlin. Now it's in Kyiv, and so it gets closer and closer and closer to Russia's border. Now we have both sides doing military exercises right on top of one another. We have constant interactions in the air over the Baltic Sea. We're face to face. We're face to face in Syria. We're face to face in the Black Sea. It's an extraordinarily dangerous situation. And so the problem is that we've been blinded by our own good intentions, I think. So how could the Russians possibly object to a defensive alliance? It's just a defensive alliance. That's what we're told. But you can't possibly look at the record and say that that's what it is, right? So it seems to me to stem from a lack of empathy, but also a lack of strategic sense. I don't know why. I don't know who they think they're making safer by expanding the alliance right up to Russia's border. So that's sort of my long-winded answer to your question.
Oh, there's much more. I want you to be more long-winded. So tell the story of Strobe Talbot. As I understand it from reading you and others, that he was the main thinker behind this, or one of the main thinkers, right?
Yeah, sure. So Talbot was an extremely accomplished Russianist as a young man. He went to Oxford with Bill Clinton. That's where they met. And while he was there, it was Talbot who translated the first Western edition of Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs. And then he went on to a distinguished career in journalism, and I believe was Time Magazine's principal correspondent in Moscow. And all those years, he was criticized by conservatives for being too soft on Russia. Then he gets appointed by his friend, Mr. Clinton, to join the State Department, and eventually became Deputy Secretary of State. And it was in those years he went from hawk to dove, particularly with regard to the
or dove to hawk.
Yes, dove to hawk.
Dove to hawk. Yes, he went to from dove to hawk. Yeah.
And they can't say that they weren't warned that this was a bad idea. There's an illuminating passage in Talbot's very good memoir called The Russian Hand, where he meets with George Kennan for dinner at Columbia, and Kennan is warning these guys, this is a really bad idea. It's going to backfire on us eventually. And Talbot is then questioned by Bill Clinton about this encounter. He's like, well, wasn't Kennan like a mentor of yours? Why are we ignoring him? And Talbot said, well, he's not the source of all wisdom on everything. I think that we should go ahead and do it. So, people like Kennan, who knew, something about Russia, right, were completely ignored during these years. And, there's a very famous interview that Kennan had with Thomas Friedman in the New York Times in, I think, 1997. And it's called Mr. X Speaks. And, Kennan was right. What happened was that this eventually was going to empower nationalist, anti-Western forces in Russia if we pursued this path. And that's exactly what's unfolded. I would just say that while from the vantage point of 2020, it does appear as though that Mr. Putin is indeed anti-Western. I don't think he started out that way, and I think that the historical record would show that. It was a series of mistakes and misunderstandings that brought us here. And which isn't to say, by the way, and I get accused of this all the time, I'm not putting all of the blame on the United States. It's just that I happen to be an American and would like American policymakers to,
of course,
hear it. The silly sort of interventions that, particularly with regard to the election in 2016, that the Russians carried out, indeed backfired very badly on them, and that was a mistake. And I think that they didn't necessarily have to, and probably shouldn't have, in violation of international law, annexed Crimea. They could have protected their naval assets without doing that. So there have been missteps and overreaching on both sides. But if you're an American, the audience that you ought to care about is the American government, right? I'm not going to be able to write anything that's going to influence the Russian government.
Right.
So,
well, you work for them. We know that already.
Yeah, I know. That's why I get to go on sweet trips up to Buffalo.
Right. It's to train you for those Moscow winters, right?
Right.
It's the closest place to Moscow in the United States is Buffalo.
That's why I'm here.
I know. All right. Let me ask you this. One of the nice things about studying U.S. foreign policy is that relatively, they're relatively open about their intentions. And then we also get declassified documents after a certain number of decades. So, we know a lot about what these guys think and what they wanted. And I'm writing a book right now about the whole history of it. So I'm going through like president after senator who was leading foreign policy thinkers over the last 200 years. Like they're talking a lot about what their visions are. And a lot of it's completely insane megalomania and it's, whatever. But we know, I don't know. Maybe it's because they don't read Russian, but I think it's probably just more secretiveness in the Kremlin. But what do you think is in Putin's mind vis-a-vis international relations and the global order? What does he want?
Right. I actually think that he, and I think I recently wrote about this, I think that he and his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, have been actually fairly transparent about what it is they want. And I think that for Russians, given where they are, right, they, unlike us, don't have two enormous oceans, east-west. They don't have a friendly neighbor to the north and a friendly neighbor to the south.
Right.
so their neighborhood is a lot rougher
The
than
roughest,
ours.
it's the roughest in world history. Let's be really clear here. It's the roughest neighborhood in world history, right?
And we haven't done and we as Americans have not made that neighborhood um, safe, right? Our repeated interventions in their neighborhood has made the region much more volatile. It made a volatile region much more volatile than it normally is. So they're very cognizant of that, and I think that people read in the headlines here, right? If I'm sitting in a cafe on Elmwood Street in Buffalo having coffee, and I'm looking through the paper and I see that Americans have thousands of troops in Syria, and we're carrying out drone strikes all over the place. Well, that doesn't really affect me, being that I'm sitting on the border of Canada and the United States. But if I'm sitting in southern Russia, right, smack up against all of this, it would. So they're very cognizant they have a different experience of our in our interventions than we do. And then this would go way beyond the time that we have, but of course the memory of the Second World War is very much alive.
Oh yeah,
over there, and we have sort of a memory that is unfortunately shaped by Spielberg and Hanks and Stephen Ambrose and things like that, right? We single-handedly won the war somehow, and that is very much a living memory over there. I was in Moscow during I guess I was there for Victory Day in 2011, and it's an enormous event. All people of all ages, all generations participate, and so we just have different lived experiences with matters of war and peace, and I think that contributes to our idealism, but also kind of our naivete. And I think that's very dangerous. And I think that in a way we are, as a nation, we are a nation of quiet Americans, and by quiet Americans, I'm referring, of course, to Graham Greene's book about, nothing much has changed. If you read that was Greene's criticism of America's meddling and intervention in Indochina, Vietnam, before the war really started. And so I think that would be, if you could assign required reading to any high government official, I think it would have to be that. And you would hope that it would awaken them from their idealistic slumber. But I have very serious doubts that that's going to happen.
So I was in the Soviet Union in 1987, spent 2 weeks touring in Tbilisi in Georgia, Moscow, and Leningrad. And in Moscow, we were taken to a military cemetery, which was one of many, many, many military cemeteries in Russia devoted entirely to World War II casualties, entirely to World War II. So the war between Germany and Russia, the Soviet Union, which began with Operation Barbarossa in 1941, is, you can look this up on the Wikipedia, everyone, the bloodiest, most lethal, awful war in human history. 10,000 people a day at times were killed in that war, maybe more, I think. This cemetery, I don't know if you've been to that. Have you been to military cemeteries devoted to World War II in Moscow?
Yeah, I went to one, yeah.
I mean, the one that we were taken to, it stretched to the horizon in every distance, in every direction. And it had graves that were the size of football fields, mass graves the size of football fields. And in each grave, 10,000 people in each one. 10,000 bodies were buried there in each one. And this was one, and you could see these football field sized mass graves to the horizon in every direction. And if you look at the casualties, a guy did an amazing video. Have you ever seen that video? I wish I could say who it was. Some guy did a video about 2 or 3 years ago about the casualties in World War II. And just when he gets to the Soviet numbers, it's your heart, your jaw, your stomach drops to the floor because it just absolutely dwarfs every other country. Those people suffered more than any other people on earth during that war. And one could say in the 20th century, no one had it worse except maybe the Poles.
Well, I was just going to say the Poles didn't make out too well.
Poles had a really bad time, but I don't know. Yeah, the Russian people suffered tremendously in ways that, as you were saying, Americans can't begin to relate to. I can only
understandable for for the ordinary American citizen they're too busy trying to make ends meet in this horrible economy and dealing with all sorts of problems. It is inexcusable for the American elite not to be aware of it, and I think that's a distinction that we should make.
So, having said all that, James, I'm gonna say I don't think you totally answered my question though about what Putin's intentions are. Are you? Are you suggesting that he's a bit of a peacenik because of the long history of Russians dying in horrible world wars, or does he want to destabilize the West, as has been charged by all of mainstream media in the United States? Does he have global intentions? Does he want to make me speak Russian? Like, what's the deal here?
I would say that stability in his own neighborhood would probably be the highest priority.
Okay.
For that. I find it very difficult to believe when I see this all the time as well, that they are great sowers of instability.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the instability is one of the things that they fear most. They do not want a United States that has a nuclear arsenal the size that we have to be unstable. They lived through a period of mass instability as recently as the 1990s, when that country suffered the largest economic and demographic collapse recorded in peacetime. So the instability and chaos is not something that I believe they want. I think that they want a stable, safe neighborhood. And when we are advancing the most powerful military alliance in history right up to their border, right up to their western border, when we are fomenting wars that go on for decades and decades on their southern border, that is a recipe for instability. And I think that stability is probably the highest value that they attach to foreign policy decisions.
Okay. So they're not global expansionists.
I don't see that. I know that is bandied about a lot. And I don't think that, I find it hard to believe that pundits and policymakers in this country could accuse any other country of being global expansionists when we have nearly 800 military bases in 80 countries around the world. China's accused of this also to do the Belt and Road Initiative, which is mainly economic in nature, though there's obviously a political element to it. They have one overseas military base. Do you know where it is?
Djibouti.
Yeah.
Right next to the Suez Canal.
Yeah.
Everybody's got a base in Djibouti, right? Doesn't Russia, China, the United States, UK, I think, right? Everybody who wants oil flowing freely through the Suez Canal has a base there, right?
So it could be that I don't see the argument. I mean, it's possible that we're going to see a great race, perhaps in the Arctic, where they're much better positioned than we are. And there's no reason that we can't compete without, collapsing into this hysteria and demonization and Cold War mentality. And one of the troubling things that I find about the Biden team is that they seem to think that we would be able to not only carry out but emerge better off for a two-front Cold War with the Russians and the Chinese. And it's sort of the opposite of the grand strategy that Kissinger and Nixon pursued to some degree. degree of success during the Cold War. So I would think that it would be a wise thing to do a different iteration of that strategy today, right? But instead, what we found during the Obama and Trump years is that our policies are driving Moscow and Beijing closer together. Well, that seems to me to be a fantastically dangerous and counterproductive idea. And
how are they driving? I think I could figure this out, but explain this, unpack it a bit. How is U.S. foreign policy driven Russia and China together, or at least the foreign policy emanating from that wing of the Democratic Party?
Well, I would say it begins with the series of sanctions that we put on.
Okay.
We put on Moscow in the months following the Ukrainian civil war. And then each time we do so, each time we make it more difficult for the Russians to do business with the West, they'll go east. And that's been happening.
Okay. In terms of trade, just increase trade with China, right? Where else are they going to get their stuff?
Well, yeah, and they need a market for, they also need a market, and the Chinese have a big market for their oil, right? So the efforts by both Republicans and Democrats to kind of scuttle Nord Stream, for instance, is a fantastically bad idea, because not only will it drive the Russians closer to the Chinese, it will also alienate our allies.
Explain what Nord Stream is. Sorry.
The Nord Stream pipeline would bring natural gas from Russia into Germany. It's been under how long has it been?
I don't know.
For many years.
Yeah.
And so, our sanctions policy is another thing that is absolutely completely out of control, and it has done a lot to alienate our friends in Europe.
Mm-hmm. So there's something you said earlier in this interview, and I think you've written this too, but it's ringing in my head, and about how the United States has wanted for decades, maybe forever, at least in the modern U.S. history, to remake Russia in our image. That's what you said. That's what you're going to stand by. That is that what that's what's the intention of the Biden foreign policy team. Is that what they're going to try to do?
No, I think that's the root of the problem.
I see. Okay.
The root of the problem is in the 1990s,
right?
With that failed policy.
Okay.
And so you have people, and you can sort of tell, like, in the 90s, the people who were very high level correspondents over in Moscow who were Americans, they also bought into this, right? Mm-hmm. And today they're the most disillusioned and hardline and anti-Russia hawks in the business, right? Because they cut their teeth over there, and the whole project fell apart. And I would encourage people. The best book on that is Stephen F. Cohen's Failed Crusade. I would urge people to find that book and read it, and that will give you the definitive history of the American democratization project in the 1990s in Russia.
Okay.
And that's the root of the problem. The Biden teams, what will we ask
what's the long game? Like, what's the long game with Russia for them, do you think?
I think that there's possibly some good news. I think that they're going to make some very serious efforts to engage the Russians on arms control, right? And I think that perhaps that would be a jumping off point for at least a lowering of tensions. I doubt very seriously that they're going to pursue another reset or something like that. Mm-hmm. But if we can get to work with them on arms control issues, perhaps we might find that we can, if not work with them on everything, at least cool it with this kind of out of control demonization of Russia and the Russian government. So it's possible that we could kind of lower the temperature during a Biden administration, but we'll have to see. I think that it depends on a number of things. And I think it also depends on how much pressure they're going to get and how much they're going to listen to countries like Germany and particularly France. Macron has been very clear that he has no interest in a new Cold War. So if there is serious about listening to our allies as they claim that they are, then we might see an improvement, a general improvement, even if it's just atmospherics. Anything would be better than the place that we are now.
Right. But Blinken and company, again, what are they after here? I mean, isn't the dream, even if it's not realizable, isn't the dream to bring Russia into NATO too? Don't they want Russia to be a satellite or a close ally of the United States to play the game?
Well, that idea had been floated many decades ago, a few decades ago, even by Putin, who said that, I think this was in the late 90s, early 2000s, very early 2000s, that he would consider it. That ship has sailed long. That ship is gone. So I don't know if they have a grand strategy with regard to Russia, and that might not be such a bad thing given the history of grand strategy as in the United States. The one area to worry about would remain Syria. Blinken has been very outspoken, even a few months ago in an interview he gave with CBS News.
Right.
It seems that he wants another bite at the apple, a regime change in Damascus. That is not going to work unless we commit, unless we really do an Iraq style.
He sounded like he was calling for more boots on the ground in Syria, like significant numbers to oust the Assad regime. Correct? That is it. That's another Iraq war.
That's what it sounded like. The thing is that it would necessarily involve a shooting war with Russia, because the Russians at the time of even in 2003, well, they weren't. First of all, they weren't as allied as closely with Saddam Hussein, as the Russians are allied very closely with Syria.
Right.
They have not only material interest there in terms of their naval base at Tartus, they are. There's a civilizational issue there as well. Syria, unlike a lot of the Middle Eastern, particularly Gulf states, is a multi-confessional state, and there are very large numbers of Orthodox Christians there.
Right.
Putin has always made it a point to position Russia as something of a what would you say, a protector of Orthodox Christians in the Middle East. So there's a cultural alignment there, which Putin takes very seriously as well. So I hope that Blinken was perhaps just, even if he didn't misspeak, I hope that he's not serious, because there is no way that that the Americans are going to be able to affect regime change in Damascus without a potentially catastrophic confrontation with the Russians. And this, besides the fact of the matter that Assad is the head of a government where you can practice your religion, and the people who want to replace him are basically the same sort of hardliners who rule Saudi Arabia. And again, the Russians, as they should, find that idea to be very offensive. We should find it very offensive. But for the life of me, I can't understand all these liberals and progressives who seem to think that pluralism is such a good thing in the United States, but would turn a blind eye to what would almost certainly happen in Syria should the Islamist factions topple the secular regime in Damascus.
I will see your prediction of an Iraq-style catastrophe, and I will raise it to World War III. You tell me that I'm being paranoid here. Okay, I've had people tell me publicly in podcasts that I'm paranoid about this. We have now, am I right, two alliances facing off mostly over the Middle East right now. We have, on the one side, we have Russia and Iran and Syria, right? They're tight right now, right? Closely aligned. And then on the other side, we have the United States, Israel, and for God's sake, Saudi Arabia on the other side. And so a shooting war in Syria, I could see inevitably involving shooting among all six of those quite large, well-armed regimes. Is that plausible?
Yeah. I mean, you would hope that it wouldn't, escalate to the point of, World War III, but that's the danger of our involvement there.
Yeah.
It doesn't serve American interests to go to war to install an Islamist regime, the same sorts of Islamists who attacked us 19 years ago.
And I don't even get it. I mean, now that we're basically energy self-sufficient, as I understand it, back in the day before then, when we depended on that oil, at least there was some rationale behind these interventions in the Middle East, right? I was still opposed to them 100%, but at least they made some sense from the point of view of foreign policymakers, right? But now that we don't need the oil, our allies in Western Europe need that oil. Then maybe that's what it's about, right? But what is in the thinking of someone like Tony Blinken, smart guy. He knows everything that you and I know and more, right? He knows everything that we know, but he sees it completely differently. I always try to get in the heads of these people as much as we can. Like, why is it so important to him, to someone like him, to intervene in fucking Syria?
Well, it's hard to know. I can't help but think that you're correct in that it doesn't make geopolitical or economic sense. So I can't help but wonder if it has to do with that particular strain of American ideology.
There it is.
And
idealism, Wilsonian
yeah,
idealism, which James Carden is an opponent of.
yeah, and I think that
Right.
The so-called humanitarian impulse blinds them to the crimes that we end up committing in pursuit of that. So it would seem to me that it will be interesting to see once they get power, if we're going to see a rash of stories coming out of Syria about chemical attacks and the rest. I suspect that we will, and that will provide the pretext to a very dangerous undertaking. I wish that they would. Let me preface this by saying no one likes to see children gassed, right? That isn't something that is comfortable, and governments shouldn't do it. But I can't help but wonder if sometimes the proposed remedies are every bit as bad as the crimes that we claim to be setting out to avenge. So that
sounds like you were suggesting there that the purported gas attacks by Assad on his own people were fakes, which is what I think.
No, it's not. I don't know. I suspect. I think some of the. I wish that people would just sort of realize that where these attacks happen be under the control of Jabhat al-Nusra and the rest, and that it
meaning U.S. allies under the control.
It would seem nonsensical to me. If you were Assad, it would seem sort of nonsensical to bring the entire world community down on your head.
Of course,
to do this after you had basically, or while you were winning, and then went on to win the war. So there are some it doesn't really seem quite logical. The bottom line is, I don't really care if he did it or didn't. It doesn't. We have. It's not up to us to be judge, jury, and executioner.
You don't care. Just hold on. You don't care in terms of U.S. foreign policy, right?
Yeah, no, not in the least.
Right.
We have mechanisms to deal with that, and they're in the United Nations.
Right.
And we ought to, and that is the correct arena in which to litigate that. That isn't up to us. But we tend to, we people like Lincoln make a big deal about caring about multilateralism, but they don't really carry it out. I wish they would actually. I wish that they would take their own rhetoric about multilateralism seriously.
All right. Last question, James. If you were the king of American foreign policy, which would be a very terrible thing because we don't want kings, but if you were, against your own wishes, tell us, what would you do? Broad strokes. Military budget, bases, troops abroad. What would you do with all that?
Right. I think that I think the time has come for a significant drawdown, not just with regard to the forever wars, but to our posture globally. I would, 800 bases in 80 countries seems a lot. But I would also really pay attention to and try to strengthen the United Nations as a forum with which to work with friends and competitors.
Okay.
And that was sort of, I would try to get the American public to rediscover kind of the Rooseveltian vision that unfortunately never really came into bloom after April 12, 1945, when Roosevelt died. And I think that, we really need to discover the value of multilateralism, but also the concept of sovereignty. And we need to understand that the surest way to American security is not by effecting regime change all over the world. It's by respecting the sovereignty of other countries, which means not invading them whenever we feel like. And indeed, that does us more harm than good. And when we see things that we object to, like gas attacks in other countries, or pogroms, or what have you, that we have a strong international forum that has widespread legitimacy with which to hash out these problems. And I think that if we had a foreign policy establishment that actually respected those ideas, those foundational ideas of the UN Charter, we would be a lot better off. We'd have a more peaceful world, but we'd also have a more prosperous country. And a country that is simply exercises its will without any meaningful checks on it, it is bound to do much damage to itself. So,
well, okay, so far so good. I would suggest that it's a possibility that Roosevelt and company had in mind for the UN all along what it became, which is essentially a front for U.S. imperialism. Right? I mean, that's sort of like the good old left and old right critique of the UN, is that it is just sort of like window dressing, or a way to justify essentially the expanded American empire, which is precisely what we've got. Ever since the United Nations was established, the American empire has just grown leaps and bounds, right? And often by using the UN as the humanitarian front group for it. No?
Well, that's possible. The other check then that I think that we ought to discover is our own Constitution. I would also urge Americans to take the American Constitution more seriously. And there's a very good group in Washington that I'd like to draw people's attention to. It's called the Committee for the Republic.
Oh yeah.
The Committee for the Republic has highlighted the dangers of what they call presidential wars, and these are wars being waged without the consent, and really largely without the oversight of Congress. And they've done invaluable work calling attention to that. So I think that even if you take the view that you espoused with regard to the United Nations, I think that we have in our possession a document that could provide a very handy guide to finding our way in the world, and that would be the Constitution. So a revival of that would make a lot of sense as well. But very rarely do you hear, elite policymakers talk about that, because it would indeed put up roadblocks to their grand plans.
Yeah. What is it? The last 6-7 wars by the United States have not been wars legally.
Yeah, well, the committee, I think, has outlined that there are currently, by their count, something like 9 wars.
9 straight? Yeah, 9 straight without congressional approval, without a congressional declaration of war, which of course is in the Constitution. But I told you the Constitution is tedious, James.
Yes, it makes for boring reading, but.
And the thing is, when you're fighting evil on a global scale, dude, rules can be, we can't always have them. So what would you do with a military budget?
It wouldn't be what it is.
Give me a number.
Can the king unilaterally?
Yes.
Well, I would predict that King James would probably have that bad boy at least. And we would make it would be a defense department that actually defends, instead of having it isn't really focused on defense anymore, right?
Yeah.
So we would re-inject the meaning of the word defense into the Department of Defense, not the Department of Endless War and Offense.
Didn't Ron Paul say, I think he said, that all we need is 1 submarine on each coast and a small standing army?
He may very well have.
How's that sound to you?
Well, at first blush, it sounds okay.
Yeah. I mean, he was in the military. He was on the Foreign Relations Committee for decades. He knows some things about it that I don't know. I mean, I can't be that naive about it. And what about the bases, the 800 bases in 80 countries? How many would you leave?
Oh, I don't know. I wouldn't think that you need 100. I suspect that, I mean, at least we should have at least a public and honest review of all of these, right? And the American people should. One of the big problems with this stuff is that the American people don't know about the 800 bases in the 80 countries, and the reason they don't know is that they're kept ignorant of it. I don't know if it's on purpose or not, but the reason they know about it is because the media doesn't cover it. So there's no sources of information in which they would find out about it, and it's not a topic of conversation every 4 years or every 2 years when people run for Congress. So it needs to get into the bloodstream of the discourse, and it isn't. And that is the job, I suppose, for people like us. And that's an uphill battle when you have, the largest media outlets in the country who refuse to discuss it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No one hates and is more afraid of the unilateral power of the president to wage war. As we know, it's the last 6, 7, 8, 9 wars have been done that way. But the only thing that might scare me more is giving the power over foreign policy to the American people. I mean, we as a people, as a country, as you very well know, is what you're just referring to, are profoundly ignorant about politics in general and foreign policy in particular. The surveys where people can't identify where Syria is on a map. They can't even identify where Washington, D.C. is half the time on a map. I mean, they don't know a thing about Syrian politics or Iranian politics or Russian politics or Chinese politics. It just, I don't know, this is sort of a broader philosophical question. And since you're a constitutionalist, going back to the constitutional order, if there ever existed, I'm not sure it ever existed, because Thomas Jefferson sent the Marines to Tripoli to remove a dictator, to remove a leader that he didn't like back in 1802 or 3, so it's always been going on. But like, to give that power over to these numbskulls we call our fellow Americans, I'm sorry to say that about foreign policy, they just are. Would it make for more unnecessary wars or fewer, do you think?
Well, I wasn't suggesting that we do it by plebiscite.
Right.
I was simply suggesting that
Sure.
the more information that they have might enable them to elect better people. And it's obviously a representative democracy. And no,
Gotcha.
I would agree with the founders' warnings about the dangers of the mob.
Right. Gotcha. This has been a blast. I'm one of those very weird people who loves talking about foreign policy. Thank God a lot of listeners do too. So I think this is going to be one of the best episodes for a lot of people. It's been a great pleasure talking with you. And so now you are on Substack exclusively. Is this correct?
It's looking that way. Yeah. So it's called the Scrum, SCRUM, the Scrum .substack.com. It's a project that I launched with two colleagues in November. Mm-hmm. The distinguished former Asia correspondent for The New Yorker, Patrick Lawrence, and the political economist, Marshall Auerbach, who has done a lot of work, writes a lot about economics and MMT. And that's where we are. We launched it and kind of in memory of two of our friends and colleagues who died in September, Steve Cohen, who I mentioned, and who was the great Russianist, and a guy by the name of Cheryl Swenninger. And Cheryl co-founded New America Foundation a number of years ago with Michael Lend. And they were, the five of us were good friends, and Cheryl and Steve were mentors really to us, and they died within 48 hours of each other in September. So we were trying to figure out a way to, carry on, I guess, their legacy in a way, but also to find to do something that was less sort of confining. And when I guess you're your own boss and your own editor, you can write whatever the hell you want. So that's been nice. So that's been the project, and we hope that people come and check it out.
Go subscribe to the Scrum on Substack. Is it a paid subscription service for you guys?
Yeah, as of 4 days ago. Yeah, we did the first month free, and then and now I believe it is subscription based.
Good.
Patrick does all the work on the magazine, so I don't know really the details.
That's a perfect division of labor. Have someone else do all the work.
Yeah.
That's how I like to divide it. So it's very cheap. I think it's like $5 a month, right? Something like that. You can get it. And it's you guys are you don't know this anyway, so I think it is, but and you get like almost daily journalism
we're trying to get stuff out there pretty frequently.
Yeah, I've seen it. It's great. You guys are really productive, so I strongly recommend it. Everyone subscribe to the Scrum on Substack to get James and his colleagues almost daily journalism. I guess it will be daily soon. James, thank you so much for this, and I would love to do something more with you in the future. Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Great. Cool. Have a great one, man. Be safe out there. Good luck in Buffalo. Take care. Thanks. All right. Bye-bye. Bye. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To join the new Renegade University, go to renegadeuniversity.com. To join the new Unregistered Underground, the supporting listeners group for the podcast, go to unregisteredunderground.com. Thanks for listening.